Welcome everyone, I'm Ginny Hallam of Halborns and you're listening to our 10 Minutes with series. Halborns are part of the brilliant Empowering People group who support with tech-enabled people solutions, and parts of our support are these 10 Minutes with sessions. In this series, we're focusing on what makes a great contract of employment, and we think it's 3 C's: compliance, obviously, commerciality, and contemporary tone. And in this session, we're looking again at the second C, commerciality, the stuff that isn't legally required in your contracts, but you can choose to include to protect your business. We think there are 2 elements to commerciality. One is all about protecting what matters most to your business, things like confidentiality and perhaps sales plans. And then the other, which we're focusing on today, which is all about protecting the pounds. And I'm joined today by my colleague and one of our most senior employment lawyers here at Halborns, Gemma Elliott, who definitely knows a thing or two about helping her clients protect the pounds when drafting employment contracts. So thanks for joining us today, Gemma.
Hi, Jenny. Yeah, great to be here.
So you're going to provide your thoughts on key areas of commerciality in employment contracts to make sure that the pounds are protected. And I think there are 3 key areas that you're going to look at initially. So the first one is around holidays and protecting how employees use those rights. Then you're going to move on to PILON clauses, so payment in lieu of notice provisions. And then you're going to talk about when employees owe the business money, plus a couple of other questions that we're going to cover off. We've only got 10 minutes, so should we get cracking?
Yes, that's
fantastic. So there are a few ways for businesses to potentially save themselves some money, some cash in respect of holiday provisions, which can often be quite costly, can't they, in terms of employees taking those holidays. So can you share a little bit about how employers can make sure that they're making the most of the holiday provisions within their contracts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, like you say, basically a contract for employment shouldn't just be a document that contains those clauses that are legally required, but ultimately it should also be a document that works for your organisation. And businesses quite often miss out on opportunities to save themselves some money within their contractual terms. And a good example of that, like you say, Ginny, is ultimately around holiday. So again, like you say, holiday can be quite costly. So just something as simple as requiring a departing employee to take holiday during their notice period. I mean, it sounds really simple, but obviously the cost saving can be quite significant, given that ultimately there's an obligation to kind of pay in lieu of any untaken holiday on termination. And ultimately, whilst we don't like to think about an employee leaving us at the start of employment, inevitably, it's important to kind of future-proof your contract of employment to ensure that it is fit for purpose and it gives you flexibility to save some costs should you choose to do so. So, yeah, it may not always be the case that you seek to rely on such a clause, but having the contractual right to require a departing employee to take their holiday during the notice period just gives you that flexibility to decide essentially what's right for the business at that appropriate stage. So it may be that you need an employee to work their entire notice period to effect a handover, but where an employee, for instance, has a lengthy notice period and any handover can be effected quite quickly, having to pay the employee for the duration of their notice period and then make an additional lump sum for any accrued untaken holiday when their employment comes to an end can be essentially quite a difficult pill to swallow and quite a costly exercise. So having a clause within your contract of employment that requires your departing employee to take that holiday during that notice period can be really useful. And it's really useful and can be particularly useful if the employee, for instance, has become disengaged or disruptive or just unproductive during their notice period. So it can be more effective actually to require them to take that untaken accrued holiday during that time so that they're effectively away from the business. Because in the absence of a clause like that, effectively you'll only be able to force your employees to take holiday during their notice period by giving them what is called the required notice, which is at least double the number of leave days that you want the employee to take. So, for example, if the employee has 4 days outstanding untaken leave, you'll have to give them at least 8 days notice to take that 4 days leave. And that's not always an effective way of using their holiday during that time. When we look at those quite onerous standard notice obligations, you should also consider building in flexibility into your contract of employment, meaning that you can require an employee to take holiday at a short notice period. So effectively within 48 hours notice, rather than that kind of double the notice of the holiday that you're requiring them to take. And again, that just kind of builds in that flexibility for those unpredictable short-term needs that can then save you kind of money in the long run in terms of just having that contractual ability to force the employee to take their holiday when it actually suits the business rather than when it suits them. Another useful contractual clause to protect the pounds is having the ability to revert an employee with an enhanced contractual entitlement to their statutory entitlement only. So, and that kind of clause can be really useful, particularly where an employee leaves, for instance, in breach of contract or where they've committed gross misconduct. Because in those circumstances, do you really want to be paying the employee in lieu of untaken annual leave above and beyond what you're legally required to do so, which obviously more senior employees tend to have a more enhanced rate of holiday. So yeah, that's another really useful way of essentially protecting the pounds when it comes to holiday.
So for something so simple as holiday, actually there's a lot to think about at the first instance when you're getting the contracts in place, isn't there? That's really really insightful, Gemma. Lots to kind of cover off in those holiday provisions, and it's not just about what you put in, it's how you craft it as well, isn't it? Making sure that it's really in plain English, straight talking, and easy to understand. So moving on in terms of PILON clauses then, so payment in lieu of notice clauses, which I'm sure most of our viewers have heard about, but if not, effectively it's a lump sum, isn't it? Instead of allowing somebody to serve out their notice when they leave employment. So are there some ways that those PILON provisions can be drafted as cost effectively as possible rather than just giving people cash when they leave?
Yes, absolutely. PILON clauses are really important, super useful, and when they're used effectively can be, like you say, a significant cost saving to a business. So I think it's really important to kind of say, first and foremost, if you don't have that contractual right to make a PILON, the employer may not be able to terminate before the end of the notice period, essentially without breaching that contract, which is really important if you want to be able to rely on your restrictive covenants, for instance. You can't breach the contract and then be able to essentially rely on it. So it can impede your ability to enforce lawfully your restrictive covenants. So that's one of the reasons why a PILON clause is super important. But in addition to just having a PILON clause, like you were saying, Ginny, ultimately, what can we do to maximise their potential in that contract to give us the flexibility to use them in a way that suits us? And when we talk about being in breach of contract, ultimately to avoid being in breach of contract and therefore being able to rely on the restrictive covenants, it's essential really that any PILON clause is crystal clear so that essentially there's no chance of an accidental breach. So it's really important that we break that down in terms of, okay, we're making a payment in lieu of notice to bring the employment to an end immediately, but ultimately what does that payment look like? So what's included in that payment and what's not included? So is it just a case of that payment in lieu of notice is in relation to basic salary, or will it include essentially things like bonus or other benefits, etc.? And one way of obviously saving money and protecting the pounds in relation to a PILON clause is to have that PILON clause reflective of basic salary only. So that's one way of making sure that it's crystal clear that ultimately any payment in lieu of notice will just reflect basic salary rather than any kind of benefits or bonus or commission, etc. A well-drafted PILON clause will also allow you to make the PILON payment by instalments, and can also include a duty on the employee to kind of mitigate his or her loss. So in the event that a former employee obtains kind of a new income stream, you may not be obliged to make any kind of further instalment payments. The other advantage of making a PILON payment in instalments is ultimately, if you have got restrictive covenants that you're hoping and seeking to rely on, they're more likely to comply with those restrictive covenants whilst ever they're essentially awaiting payment of a PILON in instalments, that they're less likely to effectively breach those restrictive covenants. So it can be a useful way of making sure that they comply with their ongoing obligations, as well as essentially kind of saving money. The other advantage of a PILON in terms of kind of cost saving is because employment effectively comes to an end immediately, which differs obviously to the situation where you place an employee on garden leave and their employment comes to an end at the end of their notice period, but they're not required to work that notice period, is ultimately things like benefits and holidays don't continue to accrue. So you've got that immediate cost saving by relying on a payment in lieu of notice clause in those circumstances.
Fantastic, some great money saving mechanisms there, Gemma, in respect of PILONs. So coming back to the cash point where employees owe the business money, perhaps they've taken a uniform with them, they've taken some tools with them when they shouldn't have done. Hopefully there's a right to make deductions clause within the contracts. Is there have you got any hints and tips as to what should be in those deductions clauses?
Yeah, and the thing is that we tend to see a lot of employment contracts that simply just don't contain a deductions clause, which is a real missed opportunity in terms of things like you were talking about there and the circumstances that can arise in relation to individuals leaving us. And the starting position, obviously, in those situations is that any deduction will be unlawful. And one of the caveats, one of the exceptions to that is unless it's authorised by the contract. So that's why it's really important to have the contractual right to make deductions. And again, the theme of a lot of what we've been talking about kind of today is making sure that those contractual provisions are really clear and unambiguous, and therefore it's clear the circumstances in which we may be able to make those deductions to avoid an unlawful deductions or breach of contract claim from an employee. But in terms of deductions, we tend to see that most contracts of employment, if they have a deductions clause, will cover the situation where there's, for instance, been an overpayment of salary, but won't necessarily consider other situations, i.e. Where someone has left and retained their laptop and refusing to give it back, for instance. And it's those kind of situations where actually you want a really clear deductions clause that allows you to make deductions for the value of any property that they've essentially kept their hands on unlawfully, but without your consent, so that essentially there's a real incentive for them to return the property in those circumstances.
Awesome. And perhaps just moving on slightly, so not obvious cost savers, but building greater flexibility to employment contracts can also indirectly help reduce costs in certain circumstances. So what might that look like? We've obviously covered off PILON, we've covered off holiday, we've covered off deductions. What about flexibility and how that might save a bit of cash?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of different ways that you can build in flexibility, but just kind of covering a couple of key points, I suppose. One thing that most contracts didn't necessarily contain relatively recently, but it was obviously something that they really needed, was kind of layoff or kind of short-term working clauses, which during the pandemic was obviously there was a real need to be able to essentially rely on such contractual clauses. So essentially that's dealing with those situations where essentially there's a temporary reduction in work, and therefore you need to either reduce the amount of time that an employee spends with you or just essentially lay them off for a short period of time until that work resumes. And in the absence of the contractual right to lay off or place them on short-term working, you're going to be in a situation where essentially you're obliged to pay an employee, even though there's no work for them to necessarily do, which is obviously not a situation that any employer wants to find themselves in. But many an employer did during the COVID-19 pandemic. Other ways to kind of build in flexibility is kind of really thinking about at the start of your employment relationship, whether there's any possibility that either an individual employee or an entire workforce might need to essentially be relocated, and if so, would you have the contractual right to do that without having to actually go through a redundancy process, which can be quite a costly process to have to go through. So just having that flexibility built into your contract of employment, where effectively you've got the ability to either relocate an individual or a workforce on a temporary basis or a permanent basis, can mean that you avoid those kind of more draconian processes that ultimately can have a kind of significant cost attached to them. So yeah, lots of different ways that you can build in flexibility from that perspective. And it's essentially really worthwhile at the start of any employment relationship trying to think about essentially these scenarios and therefore future-proofing your contract of employment wherever possible.
And I should say that for those viewers that have subscribed to our Intelligent Employment Service, all of these recommendations that Gemma's making have been included within our own employment contracts templates, written in a straight talking way, so they're easy to understand, but do give you the opportunity of saving what is sometimes fairly significant costs, where each contract has the provisions that Gemma has referred to. So thank you so much for your time. It's been super helpful to start thinking about how potentially to maximise some of the savings that are out there with the right clauses drafted in the right way, especially as we're all looking on a regular basis at how we make sure that we limit costs so far as possible. If anything we've covered today has whet your appetite in terms of looking at your own contracts of employment, then we have actually created a free automated 10-point diagnostic tool to help you get an insight into the health of your employment contracts. And you can access that diagnostic tool directly on our website. You'll also find the link, if you need it, in the video description below. If you prefer to have some personal expert support from our lawyers, perhaps with a full review or carrying out an update or redrafting your existing contracts, then we've got plenty of solutions to support you, irrespective of what your budget is. We can make sure that we have the right solution for you, and the details are on the screen, so definitely get in touch and we can discuss your requirements and recommend the best solution for the budgets that you've got available. All that's left for me to say is thank you so much, Gemma, for your time. Hope you've enjoyed delivering on the session today, and thanks for all the insights, and enjoy the rest of your day.